I just watched a video where entrepreneurs were talking about having kids or not having kids. And as a lifestyle design question, I think this is pretty huge. The role of family, the role of business, how you view your impact, the value of having kids and the impact we have on kids versus the impact we have on business and how we, see our contribution to the world. Uh, Stay tuned if you are thinking about having kids or thinking about having a business, if you're weighing what you think you want your legacy to be. I think those are the types of questions we're thinking about, and they're important things to think about as you start your business because you want to design it around the sort of impact that you want to have. How much time are you going to be spending with your kids, and what kind of time, etc. And likewise for business. What started this conversation was the comment that, and this is not judging someone's decisions, it was just a very different outlook than mine. And so there was a sharp contrast. I started talking with Meg about it. And the comment was that this person did not want to have kids because their kids wouldn't turn out to be necessarily as successful as them. They didn't want to put that burden of expectation on the kids, and that they felt like they'd have a lot more impact teaching essentially future millionaires and helping them grow their businesses. And to me, that was an interesting flip because as an engineer, when I worked in Silicon Valley, I had this epiphany. I was working at LinkedIn as a big company and just realizing how replaceable people are. That, when you leave, either your projects just disappear and it really didn't change the business, or, someone just steps into your project and manages it fine. And, people that miss you as friends, but like as a person in the machine, you're pretty replaceable. And so I wondered about, like, what about Steve Jobs, right? Everyone talks about Steve Jobs. Everyone idolizes Steve Jobs. And, what would happen if Steve Jobs didn't exist as a thought experiment? Is he replaceable? And I thought we probably would have had a slightly crappier cell phone a little bit later, and people would have picked somebody else to idolize in business. There would have been, more focus on somebody else. I'd be sad about Pixar, but like there still would have been animated films, right, et cetera. And so it's like, I feel like he's 80 to 90% replaceable. And if you're not Steve Jobs, you're 100% replaceable in business. Whereas like the flip side, if you think about kids that you have, no matter what you do, you are irreplaceable. If you don't show up a day in their life, that lack is one of the defining characteristics of their lives. And I think that's scary to some people, but I think that shows the impact that you're going to have on kids is so much more dramatically deep than the impact you're going to have on any individual as a as a business owner.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because you're talking about this impact that you have on kids. And I think some people these days especially think about the trauma their parents, gave them. Because that's a thing, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody escapes life unscathed by their parents. And mom, dad, I love you. Also, I've got scars. Just kidding. But it's one of those things. Like I was telling you how I still remember this night when I was having nightmares and I, went and knocked on my parents' door and they said, okay, it's going to be fine. Just go back to bed. You'll be great. And I kept having nightmares and I was terrified and I just wanted to lay on their floor next to their bed so I felt safe. So when I woke up from my next nightmare, I went upstairs, knocked on their door, no answer. So I tried to open it and the door was locked. And that was the first time that they'd done that. And I understand as a parent, I get it. You're exhausted. And I don't, hold this against my parents, but I do still remember it. And so we think sometimes, of this impact that we can have negatively on our children. And we don't also then focus on all of the good impact, because that's one of the things that you and I feel like focus on a lot in our lives is, yes, there's that negative affect and there is so much positive as well. And so I think when we look at, are they going to be millionaires? Who knows? Can we give them a good childhood by parents who love them? Most definitely. And I think that for me is one of the important things to kind of notice. It's not just the bad stuff, it's also the good.
Yeah, I don't want to paint an unreasonably unrealistic, rosy picture of having kids. There's the study done that the happiness of parents dips shortly after they're born, and then rises again after they leave for college or whatever, leave the house. Um, and so I think there certainly is like, it certainly will be more stress and less sleep than you would have on your own. And I think a lot of people, try and frame that like, yeah, but then you vicariously take in their part-time joy and sure, or like they're not part-time, but they're first-time joys, right? You experience life through new eyes. And I think what that's getting at for me is there is a meaning to it that there's an inherent meaningfulness to having kids, and you're meaningful to them, etc. And it's hugely significant. And it's not that I don't think you can find meaning and significance in your work, but if you look at most people, even a lot of like small business owners and people who run companies, they find there isn't the meaning they thought in work. Even people who are successful very often describe how like success didn't really bring in the happiness or ultimately the meaning they were looking for. And so it's not like I don't think you can find meaning in your work, but I think the way the conversation is framed, you have a few of like the rare exceptions who are both exceptionally good at work and who serve other people, right? They're not just good at what they do and they, chew people and spit them out on their way to success, but like they're actually service-oriented people and are trying to transform those around them or the customers or clients they serve. Even those people who are both successful and that, like those are kind of relatively few and far between, whereas like every parental experience will be meaningful, which is kind of interesting to think through.
Well, and as you were saying earlier too, like, who was it that the people that they help, they're already kind of the stars of what they do. And so it's not something that, they're completely changing their life. These are people who would have been on that track eventually anyways. They just kind of help them get there faster, maybe get farther, right? Yeah. What was that?
Well, I don't want to criticize and name drop because, again, like this isn't an attack on the person, but it was someone who I admire very much, who I think is helpful. I do think he's having an impact. So I'm not saying he isn't, but the same person also said they never hired someone who wasn't already a rock star. Like they could tell in the interview they were going to be great. And basically what they said, there's some people they thought would be great that didn't pan out, but there's nobody they thought was mediocre in an interview who turned out to be great. And I mean, that irks me as like a coach because like exactly what I'm trying to do is how to help more people be great. I'm trying to be as transformative as I can in my business. Like that is hugely important to me. But at the same time, if that's your outlook, that you're not actually really making people great, you're just finding the great ones, then like that brings into question the actual impact you have. This comes back to something in instructional design that I learned, an issue where if you look at really competitive schools where it's competitive to get in, like private schools, etc., and you look at their grades and they test well, the question is, are they actually educating those kids or do they just select the most, affluent and well-tested kids who have parents who to put money into like SAT prep and things like that? And so like, are those high scores a representation of the actual education or just the fact that you're selective? And when you kind of combine that outlook that a lot of people have in business, that you're either great or you're not, with the idea they feel like they're having an impact training people, I'm like, those two things are directly at odds. If they're already great, you're just helping someone great get to their destination maybe a little bit faster or like, expand their influence a little bit more, but you're not actually fundamentally transforming them. Whereas like with kids, they're this, crazy mirror of you. Yeah. They imprint on you. They're not going to follow you exactly. They're not going to look exactly like you, but everything you do is going to impact them, even the things you don't think about.
Yeah. And it's been an interesting thing as, a mother. So for me, having kids was always just a given. It was something that I was going to do because that's what you do as a human being. And so I never really questioned, do I want kids or not? After I had kids, I realized, oh my gosh, this is really, really hard. And that's at the point where I started to question, should I have done this? And obviously I know, I'm not going to like stop having kids because they exist already. I did stop having kids.
Having new kids.
Having new kids, right? But you don't give back the kids that you have, nor would I want to. But it had me kind of reflecting on that. What would I have chosen had I gone back and reevaluated that, because my life is, there's no question, it is harder now because I have kids than it was before I had kids. And I didn't really appreciate that fully before. And then I also look at it like, well, yes, it's harder. Also, I have more love. I have these two amazing creatures who inspire me every day, that I get to live with and be a part of, and feel so blessed to be a part of their life. And I've learned so much more. I have grown so much more as a person because I have kids, which is not to say I want to grow as a person, I should have kids. Don't do that. But it is something that I am grateful for, that I've been able to become a better person that I wouldn't have without being a parent, which again isn't going to be true for everybody. So I never want to like push this on people, but it is true for me.
Right. Well, and that's, I think you're getting at something that I think impact is tied to difficulty.
Yeah.
If something's not difficult, is it really impactful? I'm actually reading The Dark Tower, and there's a kid in that who has, parents who are very well-to-do, so he's raised essentially by his nanny, and like he doesn't really have a strong attachment to his parents, and basically the ease with which they raised him, the not being involved, took all the meaningfulness out of that relationship.
Yeah.
And I do kind of wonder, like, to the extent that raising kids is harder, is that tied to the inherent meaningfulness, meaning that like if you're avoiding kids because they're hard and they would be a hardship on your life, and you're saying I'm going to find significance in my job, which is less hard, I do wonder to the extent like if it's less hard, does that inherently make it less meaningful? Or I think maybe rephrasing that, human beings tend to find value in the things that are difficult.
Yeah.
And so it's not that something, in some abstract, objective, universal sense is more valuable because it's hard, but because the way we're wired.
Yeah.
Like, are you going to find as much meaning in something that you're recognizing on some level is less hard than, excuse me, my voice is going.
Get your water.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm going to interrupt because he's drinking.
Go for it.
So I like to look at one of the best jobs that I've ever had, which was being a principal at a school in Japan. It was this immersion school out in the middle of nowhere, and it was hard. There's no question about it. And I was needed. I was so valued because there was nobody else at that point who could do what I was doing. And what was so great about it is that people constantly told me that people were always saying, oh, Meg, we are so grateful for you, for all of the things you do. And I soaked that up. I love feeling needed and being acknowledged for feeling needed. And so I already had both of my kids by that point, and I wasn't getting thanked for taking care of them and changing dirty diapers and getting puked on and all of the thankless work that parents do, which you are doing more of at the time. Thank you. But I was looking at that, and I didn't have that external reward at the time because that's not what happens, with kids. And I was thinking, well, I'm gaining so much more from my job at this point. But looking back, I recognize, like, yes, I got a lot from that job, and I gave a lot to that job, and it was hard, and I grew a lot as a person. Still not as much as I have as a parent, nor was I giving as much as I have given as a parent. And so I impacted those students that I had greatly. But some of them, may not remember me as they get older, which is fine. My kids will never forget me. And I know that if I were to die or something, they would be devastated. And there's something really valuable for me knowing that I'm having that impact on them and that I can give them that love that they need. So, when they're coming and knocking on my door, Mommy, I just want to check on you. I'm doing okay. Okay, just checking. And then they close my door. I find that sweet and endearing, and I want to be there for them in that capacity.
Yeah, it is harder to see when they're younger kids. And I think what you're highlighting is kind of proving the hypothesis that actually it's the difficult things that will become meaningful.
Yeah.
If you look back, I mean, considering we talked a little bit about this in our conversation on our weekly, our daily check-ins and how that evolved from different forms of communication.
Which, if you haven't seen it, you should go watch it.
Yeah, link below. And but one of the things that precipitated several of those evolutions was having kids because of the stress, but also that job because we moved to the middle of nowhere in Japan and it required a lot of your time. And I was trying to be a dad and also starting entrepreneurship very badly in the dark, fumbling. And all of those stresses produced another need to communicate. And a lot of the reasons why we've evolved, not just as individuals, or as parents, but as a couple, is because of the stresses. And the greater of that was definitely the kids. But business did precipitate some opportunities to have that development, like not business by itself, but by the fact that it was hard and you were really invested in it.
Yes. Well, and I think too, it's important to note that we are very, I don't know if I should say lucky, but the fact that these difficulties have brought us closer isn't always the case. That for some people, it drives them apart. Divorce is very common. And I get that. And I get how lucky we are to have found each other and knowing that we find meaning in these struggles. And it is hard sometimes, especially in the thick of things when you're so exhausted to be, thinking this is meaningful. This is not meaningful. I'm so tired. But at the same time, being able to do that with a partner, with somebody that we found ways to grow stronger as a couple, as a family. I've even noticed this summer as I've had to be kind of stepping back from a lot of different responsibilities as I've recovered from surgery and things like that. And having those times when I haven't been available to the kids, that I haven't grown as much. I haven't had as much fun. And so now that I'm starting to kind of come back into my life, I've really enjoyed getting that back, right? That time spent with you guys during dinners, playing our silly games. And sometimes I think, I just want to have a quiet dinner. And then other times I'm like, no, let's just play these ridiculous games. The word game, would you rather, things like that, or the letter game. It's so fun. And you don't realize how much you miss it until it's gone. And then when you get it back, it's like, yay.
Yeah, so, I think a couple of things we've highlighted is that kids will definitely create a lot of stress and demand a lot of you. That's a lot of what makes it meaningful. And for most people, that will be more than the demands of a job and the needs of a job. In terms of individual impact, it's really difficult for me. Just biologically, even, spiritual and philosophical opinions and beliefs aside, just biologically, like when you have the most impact on someone is going to be when they're a little kid. And so you're going to have the most transformational impact on individuals. I think a blind spot that I have, and maybe there is utility, but I don't really care about being broadly famous or known or having a broad impact. When I think about the impact I want to have on, as a business or as anything, it's not that I don't want more people to hear about what I do or benefit from what I do, but for me, it's the one-on-one impact, which is part of the reason why I do coaching.
You'd rather have a deep impact than a broad impact.
And so I definitely devalue, my impact on society at large in general. That's something that I think is the major trade-off that people are weighing if they go for business. I think they're finding more value in impacting a greater number of people.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm like, but if you didn't exist, yes, it was hundreds of thousands of people, but if you didn't exist, they would probably just go for the next best alternative.
Yeah. Well, and it's an interesting thing when you look at that, broad perspective. It's also helping those people in a broad perspective in something that person inherently values, right? And so if business is where they derive their meaning, they want to make sure that they are helping people with that thing that they value.
Yeah.
Whereas we were talking this morning how you don't get to decide what your kids are going to value. You just hope that it's something that aligns with your values and then help them grow into that.
I have zero musical, like, natural ability. I have some training, but our oldest has a natural ear for the, for music. And I think that's fascinating. I try and learn more and practice music more than I would otherwise to try and like encourage him and normalize that. But yeah, that's one point. One interesting thing about a kid is it forces you to try and provide value in areas where you feel you're not strong.
Yeah.
And I think the reverse is also true, and that's the hardest thing about being a parent is sometimes you do need to help them in something they don't value.
Yeah.
Which, like, as a business, just give up, don't do that. Like,
Yeah.
there's no point. But that is something you will not have to grapple with, but it's critical. So, like, controlling your temper as a kid, that learning how to pay attention, keep your hands to yourself when you're not inclined to, like, all these. We have little kids, you can tell, but all of those things that they are not like personally inclined to do, you have to have an impact on them with that, which I think is it is a very different aspect.
Yeah. Or even something, I'm not great at cleaning. I don't like cleaning. And I'm still trying to impart to our children the importance of cleaning when my room, not that clean. And so it's one of those things that I don't even highly value it. But if you recognize the importance, learning how to promote something that, may not be one of your core values, but also is something that you value enough to try and impart to the next generation. I guess that's where a lot of my kind of personal improvement, with parenting has come from, is those things like, what do I want to impart to my children? Kindness, trying hard things, the value of hard work and not just being good at something and doing the stuff that you're good at, but actually trying things that you may not be good at to begin with. And then you become good at them with practice. Like that for me has been a wonderful thing to kind of reflect back on my life and say, well, yeah, I do frequently do the things that I enjoy, not the ones that are hard. And so, but if I want to teach my kids that, then I have to get better at it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that is when I got a lot more into cleaning.
Yeah.
Because we lift, I do, I'm very like maximal impact, minimal effort still. I'm not a perfectionist at cleaning. But I do remember we live like college students, and I was born, I'm like, I want him to be able to do it so that at a minimum, I mean, one, I think there's a psychological benefit to cleaning things up and having a clearer space in terms of focus and other things and mental well-being. So like there is an impact, and I want him to grow up in a space that feels better.
Yeah.
That feels less cluttered and crazy. But also just for less friction in his relationships when he has like college roommates, family. Eventually, like it's just a good life skill to have.
Yeah. When you look at our kids, like they like cleaning toilets, like the insides. They don't like doing the outsides, but the insides, and that's a step beyond anything I ever felt.
Yeah.
And so seeing that I love cleaning toilets. I love cleaning mirrors. I don't know. It's very heartwarming.
I think the knowing, no matter what you do, they will model it to some extent. There won't be clones of you. They'll have their own take on it, but like they will absorb lots of like behaviors and attitudes of you, even that you're not aware of. That made me want to be a better person.
Yeah.
And it does kind of bring me back to, I think, one reason why people are avoidant of having kids, which is like, that I'm not a perfect person. So since I'm not a perfect person, I will inherently, psychologically traumatize my kids in some form or fashion, regardless of what I do. I don't like parent them the same way my parents do. I avoid some of the things they did that didn't work for me, and now I'm just doing different things that don't work for my kids. Or like it doesn't make a difference, partly because like kids get angry sometimes. Like you shouldn't try and keep them happy all the time.
Yeah.
They're going to have to confront disappointment and anger and things like that. And so that is scary, but one of the things that I get reminded about that's helpful is I was reading one of Jonathan Haidt's books. I think it's The Happiness Hypothesis, where he says that even people in abject poverty are they actually are happy with most areas of their lives. And this is like people who are human trafficked. Even like you would say like there's so much suffering in their lives. And I think sometimes the implication of how people talk about this when they're thinking not of the actual individuals that exist, but they're thinking about like bringing someone into the world, they're like, well, it's better not to exist than, to have suffering. And I'm like, well, actually, the people who have a lot of suffering right now seem to beg to differ if they're happy with most areas of their life.
Yeah, well, and the world is a scary place, like with global warming, climate change, and COVID and war, and there is so much suffering. You kind of think, well, would you rather not exist? And this is where I was saying, you think in more abstract terms. I don't necessarily think of, well, a creation that doesn't already exist can't suffer, and so is that better? Or like, I don't even really think about that, but the idea that creating something that can then have joy, that can then be a part of the world. I don't know. You would probably speak better to that than I would.
I mean, I'm just thinking from the perspective of like, well, we can't speak for the perspective of people who never existed because their parents chose not to have them or have kids or, focus on other areas. But from the people who do exist, the vast majority of them would rather exist, even with suffering, which, I mean, it says something to me about the value of existence. And so when I personally get into a space where it's like, oh, are kids better off than, not existing than without me? It's kind of like, well, get out of my own head. They're going to have their own life and they're going to find it meaningful. And some of the things that I do wrong that they overcome will be meaningful for me or meaningful for them, just the way, that my parents, who I had a very good relationship with, who are imperfect, some of the struggles I had with them were meaningful and have changed the way I live my life. Yeah. And so again, like I do also just sort of live in a space where I think suffering and hardship, at least philosophically, are not the worst things that can happen, and often can be good. It depends on how you react to them, but like you really can't grow without difficulty or resistance. And so, the idea that kids make things harder for you, or you as an imperfect parent will make things inevitably harder for them in some ways, is bad. Is like, I don't think that's a foregone conclusion.
Yeah. And well, I mean, the fact that they will suffer, yes, that is a foregone conclusion. That's going to happen, but again, that there's meaning in that.
Right. That is a bad thing.
Yeah. That
there will be suffering. Right.
Yeah.
They will find meaning not only in the joys, but often as much or more in the difficulties.
Yeah.
So this is, again, not to say you have to, have kids and not have a job, or have a job and not have kids, because we're doing both. But it does play into how you think about your impact. And I tend to be someone who focuses very much on individual impact, which is why I make time for kids. I don't want to work 14 hours a day on my business. And even when I am in business, I am trying to have a deeper impact on individuals than necessarily focus on a broad impact. Even when I do YouTube videos, I think the way I phrase that is that, for me, I hope at some point that the breadth of impact allows me to have a very deeper impact on a few individuals. Like the breadth of impact is just like a means to an end, where I hope to have a deeper impact on individuals. So like that's my calculus. And I am very intentionally I'm very intentionally just don't recognize or really gel with the idea of like there's a value to having a lot of people know you.
Yeah.
Like impact is important, but like if I was putting impact aside on a business and it's like rich and famous, or just rich, I would definitely like rich. Rich, not famous would be the ideal for me, because there's just like, the value isn't there in that proposition for me. You might have a different calculus, but it's helpful to sit down and think about like, well, what is your legacy? One thing I think we discussed, and maybe like a last issue to mention, that's interesting, is that, in business, you kind of choose your legacy. You're choosing your niche, you're choosing your target audience, and, giving them what they're asking for. And that's your legacy. You can kind of shape your legacy of leadership or mentorship within your company. But the interesting thing about kids is you can't control that legacy. they just absorb, they're just a mirror. And that is humbling, I think, because I get a more accurate view of what my legacy actually is and who I actually am by having that reflected in me as a kid. And I think for some people, the idea that you don't get to control that is intimidating, or alternatively, maybe not intimidating, but they view that as lesser because it's an unknown quantity. Whereas for me, it's like, that's the real measure of like who I am and what impact I have is like what my kids take away from me. And it's not always good stuff, unfortunately, but
well, and one of the things with unknowns though is that it can also be better than what you thought. And that's what I've found with parenting, that, you know, the initial baby phase was crazy and hard, but as they get older, every day I'm seeing like, oh, they actually took that from me. Like, that's a thing that I believe and I really, you know, think about. And so, you know, but that I never would have imparted to a client because we just don't have those sorts of interactions. And so in some ways, yeah, that legacy gets to be greater than you can imagine.
And unless you're in a very few select industries, most of your clients aren't like 4 years old and like still developing massively in their brain space, right?
Yeah.
So,
although preschool teachers, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I hope this is helpful. Just thinking through what impact is for you and what your legacy is for you, and you just want to design your business that way. If family is important to you, are you in a business that's going to allow you to spend time? Are you in a business that's going to require you to travel a lot and be away? If you are, like, how are you going to make that work with your family? And vice versa. Think about like the impact in your business. Are you going for like the easiest possible business that you can? If so, it might not yield the same meaning for you or for your clients as if you really lean into some of the difficult and stressful problems and solve those for other people. So, you know, either way, I think there is taking a moment out, journaling maybe, or recording audio of yourself thinking aloud or talking to somebody else about this can be really helpful in how you frame both your family and business impact. Well, I think that's it.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. Until next week, make big changes, one small habit at a time.